Sister Annmarie Sanders is the Associate Director for Communications for the Leadership Conference of Women Religious. She very much wanted to be here in person to tell us about LCWR's Discerning Our Emerging Future initiative. This initiative was created by LCWR in support of Institutes of Women Religious as they explored together how collectively to organize for mission at a time of dramatic change. While she wasn't able to join us last minute, we are grateful that she sent in a video of her presentation. Annmarie Sanders.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sister Annmarie Sanders, and I serve as the Communications Director of the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, or LCWR. I bring you greetings from all of us on the staff of LCWR, as well as our deep appreciation for the work that you do. The efforts that you are making to promote religious life and provide such excellent communications in a wide variety of ways do not go unnoticed. We consider your work absolutely essential. I so wish I could say that to each of you in person this day. I've been invited to share with you an important initiative of LCWR and how it relates to our work as communicators today. As you well know, this is a time of dramatic change in religious life. In response to this change, LCWR is shepherding an initiative that involves collaboration and creativity for living religious life in the present and near future. So I consider this a great opportunity to welcome you as communicators into this effort, especially since communicators are known for being both highly collaborative and highly creative. Collaboration and creativity are so needed right now and needed in abundance. So, what is LCWR? I don't want to take it for granted that all of you are familiar with LCWR, since I know some of you are new in your roles. Nor do I think you know about LCWR's role in U.S. religious life. LCWR is a membership organization for those serving in elected leadership roles in religious life. In some ways, it's a parallel organization with other organizations serving religious life, such as CWR, or the National Religious Vocation Conference, or the Justice Conference for Women Religious, and so many other organizations. But it's also different from these organizations in terms of its connection to the Catholic Church and because of its prominent role throughout the history of religious life. Unlike other organizations, LCWR is a canonical entity. In the 1950s, the Vatican asked every country where there were Catholic religious to establish a conference of superiors or leaders of all communities. LCWR was established under a different name in 1956. And because it was founded at the request of the Church, it has both recognition and status within the official Catholic Church. As you can see here, LCWR can even have a meeting with the Pope. So since the time of its founding, probably due to a host of reasons, including leadership by some outstanding, forward-thinking, courageous women, the organization has become prominent as a forerunner in leading change within religious life and as an outspoken advocate for change in society and in many areas of injustice. It's also watched closely by religious throughout the world, since historically, the religious of the United States are often ones who are a bit ahead of the pack when it comes to change. So if you've ever wondered why the sisters in your own communities are interested in LCWR events, publications, or statements, it's probably because of this important role it has played over the 65 years since its founding. Although it has no jurisdiction over its members, generally, if LCWR encourages its members to undertake an action, leaders take that encouragement seriously. Perhaps not as a mandate, but at least as something that deserves significant attention. So I hope that brief explanation provides some explanation for why a presentation today on an LCWR initiative would be important for communicators to hear. This initiative, although coming from one organization, that of leaders, impacts all who are working on behalf of religious life. So I'm very grateful to have the opportunity today to share with you some background on the initiative so that you have a clear understanding of it and so that you can be as much of a support to your own communities as they work with it themselves. So in brief, this LCWR initiative, called the National Discernment of the Emerging Future of Religious Life, attempts to address the sobering reality that the vast majority of religious institutes in the United States are comprised of mostly elders, that many communities are coming to a close, and that those that are left will be smaller and will administer themselves in the future, most likely in much simpler, streamlined ways than in the past. Small institutes will probably not need the structures that have been in place for decades as communities grew large. The LCWR initiative seeks to support those in leadership as they make decisions about their own communities and their future. How can institutes support one another in this time of change? How might they share resources? What creative ways can they come together to govern and administer the institutes that still have a future? In what ways could leadership be shared? These are very different questions than the questions that we had even just a few years ago. So a few statistics. The size of religious institutes today: 1/3 have fewer than 50 members. The age of women religious in the United States today: 8 in 10 women religious today are age 70 and older. 58% of religious institutes have a median age of 80 or older. And then the capacity of future leadership within the membership of a community. Most institutes think they will have enough people to serve in leadership and serve as delegates in a chapter through the year 2025. Those numbers decrease greatly beyond that time. And as you probably know, when an institute no longer has the capacity to hold a chapter, it's an indication that there are serious and urgent realities that need to be addressed. So this is the larger context of religious life in the United States. And your own institute fits somewhere into that picture. No matter where your own institute is, understanding this larger context is really key for your communications role, since every institute and every sister is impacted by this reality, whether that sister speaks of it or not. So the background that I will share in this presentation comes from the observations made by the planning group for this initiative, of which I am a part. That initiative is seeking ways to find means together as a body of U.S. women religious to address this serious situation. These observations have been made after review of a study commissioned by LCWR on the capacity of U.S. religious communities to sustain themselves into the future. And after numerous meetings with many people working with religious institutes, and after a series of 26 listening sessions, the planning group held with LCWR members last fall. So we did a wide consultation. The discernment of the planning group led to naming 3 major paradigm shifts taking place within religious life today. So in this presentation, I'm going to unpack those paradigm shifts a bit. A little bit of background. As you all know, we're living in this world in a time of seismic shifts with globalization, the collapse of institutions, the rapid growth of technology, and so much more. This is a time when the whole world is re-examining ideas that previously we might have thought unchangeable. This is a time when we're looking at assumptions we once held and now wonder, do they need to shift because of what we're now learning and discovering? As we look at the larger shifts in society, we're looking as well at the shifts within religious life. So that first shift I'd like to talk about, calling identity. The shifts occurring in religious life today are so deep that they require religious to revisit questions of our very identity as religious. Elements of this life that we assumed were just a given or would be permanent are changing. One example of this is the less visible and prominent role that Catholic sisters play today in society and in the church. That role is not anywhere near as clear as it was in the past. Sisters, often dressed in clothing that distinguished them, and who most often lived in large convents that also distinguished them, were known for building schools, hospitals, and centers that responded to all kinds of unmet needs. Your congregation histories are probably replete with accounts of significant contributions your sisters made to meet the needs of the people they served. And they met those needs often in large institutional ways. Today, those needs are often being met by other entities. And those very institutions sisters founded have often closed or are staffed by laypersons. For those of us who work to support religious life, I think it's really helpful to remember that this shift is an enormous one, and that the change probably plays out in sisters' lives in ways in which they may not at times even be conscious of. The majority of sisters today lived through a time when what sisters built and were known for in a specific geographic area shaped their identity. The public associated sisters with the universities, academies, hospitals, and more that their communities built and staffed. They associated sisters with large mother houses and properties. These large visible signs of the existence and contributions of sisters made sisters people whom the public could identify, understand somewhat, and usually appreciate. As these ministries, buildings, and properties are slowly removed from the lives of the sisters are left to not only redefine who they are for the public's understanding, but also for our own understanding. When all that I have worked for or watched my community work for and build up is no longer in existence, or it's in existence but has little association with who I am or with who we are as a group today, then where do I find my identity? You may hear sisters asking, what does it mean to live a vowed life as a woman religious at this time? I actually think it's a great time to be a woman religious, but surely it surely does not mean what it did even just a few years ago. We're in an in-between time as we see religious life shifting as it becomes smaller and often less visible or noticeable in society. We sense that we're being called to live religious life in a different way, but usually we don't even have the language yet to describe what this new way is. As communicators, it's especially important to understand this shift, and we'll speak more about this later. It's a shift that speaks to the very essence of religious life and understanding that your sisters are undergoing this change. That's critical for your work. And as we seek to understand our identity in these times, you can be invaluable in helping us find language and express that identity in clear and understandable ways. So the second paradigm shift I'd like to talk about, I'm calling widening and deepening collaboration. In society today, we see how our consciousness is shifting significantly as we discover how truly interdependent our world is, as well as how fragile it is. Only by working together across the boundaries that have historically divided us will the planet even be able to survive. We see this parallel consciousness arising in religious life as well. Increasingly, our congregations are entering into partnerships and alliances, not only with other religious or other Catholic entities, but with many other movements and organizations that value the common good. Most of the women in religious life today lived through years where every religious institute operated quite independently. There might have been some interaction among religious of various communities on occasion, and more recently, religious institutes have collaborated to offer services more frequently than in the past. But for the most part, women religious have run their own institutions and ministries and are accustomed to being in charge. So this movement towards collaboration can come with some challenges. Women religious often see themselves as very collaborative, but our collaboration often occurs in what we could call vertical models. In the vertical model, we're still in charge, but just working with other people whom we bring into our ways of doing things. So there seems to be an invitation today towards more horizontal collaboration, where we walk side by side with others with a common vision. Even when others' ways of operating may be unfamiliar, make us uncomfortable, or have us relinquish control. We're observing that congregations are deep into the work of making this shift to horizontal collaboration by focusing on the work of transitioning. So, for example, many are engaged in proactive planning that looks at transitioning sponsored institutions or congregation ministries to lay leadership, and are doing so in a variety of ways, depending on their own congregation realities. They're making plans for the transition of their properties and buildings. And they're partnering with other entities whose mission to impact the world for good are compatible with theirs and are finding creative ways to contribute to those entities. So the third and last paradigm shift I'd like to talk about, calling intergenerational and intercultural vision and energy. The demographics on new members in religious life already show us that the future of religious life in this country will be much more culturally diverse than it has been before. We see this among our own newer members in our congregations. As we know that this reality, and as we know, this reality brings both great gifts and great challenges. Members of religious congregations today who are from cultures other than a dominant culture are actively calling their communities to re-examine the Western or Eurocentric models that continue to define how religious life is lived here in the United States. They're now asking their communities to be more inclusive of the ways of leading, praying, living mission, and being in solidarity with one another that characterize religious life of the global South and the Asian cultures. We also see in religious life today more of a struggle to intentionally keep an appreciation for the various generations alive. The vast majority of members in our communities are in their 70s, 80s, 90s, and even 100s. The work to appreciate the generational differences of younger generations is significant. This is a time when older religious need to ponder what it means to be an elder, which includes the capacity to share the love and wisdom acquired over a lifetime with younger generations, and to bless and support those who are younger. Our LCWR Planning Committee had the opportunity to engage with many young Catholic sisters. Their passion for vowed religious life, a life intentionally lived for God, in community, focused on mission, is incredibly strong. Equally strong is the passion for mission, for being in the midst of the needs of the people they enter to serve. I think I could say that for all of us at LCWR who are working on this initiative on religious life, that it's the desire to live religious life to its fullest that we have witnessed among newer members that fuels the fire that keeps us going in this work with this LCWR initiative. The passion and desire of younger religious and their belief in the value of religious life really are almost dazzling in their intensity. What we often hear from newer religious is less concern about how religious life will be lived in the future, and much more interest in how it's being lived today. These women desire to live this life fully in the present. And they recognize that with so much change that's happening and happening fast, it's virtually impossible to know what religious life will be in the future. They simply trust that each change will show them the next step that needs to be taken. So a place of challenge in religious life today is how to assure that future generations have in place what they will need to have a viable future. How do we provide younger members with the freedom to imagine and create a future for living religious life and not be saddled with the burdens and structures of the past? So I'd like to talk about a few more challenges that are before us. So what are religious institutes experiencing as they move with these paradigm shifts? What are they naming as challenges? Here are a few of them. Lack of an appropriate or realistic response to the urgency of this time that's seen by nearly everyone outside of religious life. Congregations that have already engaged in the process of right-sizing their communities report that it takes far longer to do that right-sizing than they ever anticipated. Their regret, which we heard often, is that they delayed getting started. Another challenge is the denial that realities are significantly changing, or at least an acceptance with the hope that the reality doesn't change too much while I'm alive. Another challenge, the desire to hold on to the governance structures, ministries, and way of life that served when religious institutes had large numbers. Unrealistic expectations that we can maintain what the Institute once had are very prevalent. And another challenge. The times are growing so complex that making and managing change on so many fronts is very difficult. So I'm going to conclude this section with the words of the president of the Sisters of Mercy of the Americas, Sister Pat McDermott, speaking about the planning process for her institute and what that institute has learned through the process. She said this: vision is a must. Our members need to know and believe that the why of what we're doing is not only meaningful, but it's clear and compelling to animate difficult choices. That vision must be about mission and our life. I believe this is where communicators can play a really important role. In all that we produce, both for internal use and for external use, we can keep reminding people of the vision for mission that motivates all that women religious do. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the role of communicators in all of this. I think both the data and these observations show clearly that religious life is in a critical state right now. There is still vitality in religious life, lots of goodwill, sisters with expertise in helping to figure out a different future, some incredible young religious who want this life to flourish, and many, many people who are willing to help U.S. religious institutes figure out how to organize themselves for a different future. I believe that at this challenging time in religious life, communicators really can play an essential and vital role. How and what we communicate about religious life can significantly impact both the sisters themselves and the public, as the public seeks to understand and support religious life during this time of change. So I'm going to suggest a number of things, 7 to be exact, that communicators can be doing that can be helpful for the congregations you serve, I believe. So the first recommendations or observations have to do with internal communications. And the first would be to provide honest, realistic information about the congregation's future. Now, of course, as you know, this needs to be done in conjunction with the leaders of your own communities. But I would encourage you to encourage them to provide the sisters with information about the realities of their future. This needs to be done thoughtfully and carefully so as not to alarm the sisters or overburden them with more than they need to know. But honest communication is bound to be more helpful in the end than withholding information. Your sisters probably already know on some level that things are going to change for them. Speaking of it openly is very healthy. So, a second recommendation: provide resources that can help the sisters live peacefully within uncertainty. An interior disposition that can be at peace, even in the face of questions for which there are no answers, is essential. We have to accept that this change that we're in the midst of is rapid, and it doesn't ease up, and it probably will not ease up anytime soon. So we keep hearing leaders say who've made some of these changes, once one change is made, more change will follow. So I suggest you provide examples of how your institute has a whole history of living with uncertainty. What changes did sisters make in previous decades to sustain the life of the institute? How is the acceptance of change part of your own institute's very culture? What is there to learn today from this? This may be a place where you can bring in the voices and experiences of younger generations. Change for them is natural and just a part of life. They've never known certainty. So might they have some wisdom to share with those of older generations? And I say this whether you have young sisters in your own communities or not. Bring in young lay men and women to have them speak about living with uncertainty. So a third recommendation is to emphasize the very value of presence. In the midst of all of this change, we seem to be invited to embrace the value of presence. Women religious have been known for, held up for, admired for what they do today and have done in the past. However, religious seem to be invited into a new place now that values being, perhaps at times even overdoing. Being a presence of love might be the most important call these days for religious. This is all part of that sense of understanding the identity of women religious today. So if you can, as communicators, tell stories of how your sisters are making a difference simply through their presence to others. There's such a value in that. A fourth recommendation: stress the advantages of being unencumbered. These are times for deconstruction in religious institutes. Communities are giving up their buildings, selling their property, handing over the oversight of sponsored works to others. All of these actions can simply feel like loss. Sisters naturally question whether the community is doing the right thing now, or questioning if they did the right thing in the past. You know, they say, oh, if we had not left teaching, would we have had more vocations? Had we held on to our health system, would we be in a better position to continue our mission? This is a time when stories of what can happen when a new sense of lightness comes over a community. What's it like when the community is not burdened with the worries of staffing sponsored ministries, finding sisters to serve on boards, getting sisters to be on internal committees in your own institutes, or whatever else we keep trying to carry on now as we did when we had many and much younger sisters? What are the possibilities, the new possibilities now? What new ways are sisters finding to live the mission when they don't have the worries of maintaining what was important in the past? So I suggest you highlight these stories in your publications or on social media. So the next 3 recommendations have to do with both external and internal communications. So the 5th recommendation is that, just to demonstrate how partnerships can be a way of generating new possibilities. Religious institutes are finding that they do not necessarily have to be the initiators of projects or other efforts to respond to the unmet needs of society. There are many organizations that are doing work that's very similar to what sisters have done over the centuries. Women religious are offering themselves more frequently as partners in these efforts. This does not always come easily, especially for women who have had to be in charge of large works in the past. However, when it does work, the results can really be extraordinary. What we hear often from communities that are engaged in partnerships is that they are finding that organizations deeply appreciate some of the very unique skills and experience that women religious bring to these partnerships. And they're probably things that sisters may just take for granted about themselves. For example, we hear how organizations that are partnering with women religious cherish the capacities of religious. And those capacities, they don't necessarily come from our professional expertise, but rather they often come from living this communal way of life. So for example, partners value that religious know how to work together to achieve a goal. Sisters know how to deal with conflict. They know how to foster relationships. And they know how to bring questions of justice and compassion to almost any conversation happening. Furthermore, sisters usually know what life is like for people on the margins of society. They know it because they've been down in the trenches with people who are suffering, people who are oppressed. So sisters may no longer be the designated leaders in organizations with which they partner. However, they are bringing influence and a spiritual maturity to new partnerships, which are equally valuable contributions. So tell those stories. So the 6th recommendation, tell the stories of how collaboration is already occurring in religious life. While the realization has been slow, many institutes see that in the future, most likely no one institute will go into the future alone. Collaboration among women religious across charisms, across congregations, will most likely be a way of life. People today speak about a trans-congregational way of religious life, meaning it will be lived across the boundaries of congregations. And this movement is already occurring in many places. For example, congregations are finding others who will serve as their commissaries. If you haven't heard that word, commissary, Commissaries are persons serving as the general superior of another institute, the top leader of another institute, when that institute no longer has members who can serve in leadership. So it could very well be that your sisters will be called into some of those roles for other institutes. I think we have some people who are in your midst at this conference who can talk about some of their experiences because they're involved in some of the other things I'm going to mention. For example, the Sisters of the Precious Blood and the Franciscan Sisters of Mary in the St. Louis area have formed a collaborative governance entity that will provide leadership for these two communities. That's an interesting thing to watch. On July 1st, 6 regions of the Sisters of Mercy of the Americas, so that includes the United States, Latin America, Philippines, Guam, became one institute with one leadership team and alternate ways of attending to the local needs of the sisters. So they're now a body of more than, I believe, 3,000 sisters. So how they work through their governance in this new model will be interesting to watch and learn from. Another example is the Wisconsin Leadership Collaborative. And I imagine that there are people from Wisconsin at the conference this week. So here there are 9 communities that realize that soon they will not need their own offices for things such as finances, human resources, communications, housing, elder care. So they came together to form one entity where they can purchase those services when their own community is ready to let go of those offices. I don't know if there are any Canadians with us this week, but the Canadian Religious Stewardship is a somewhat similar entity where communities of men and women religious throughout all of Canada also purchase the services that they need. There are various Charism families coming together to explore how they might assist one another with governance. So talk to the Sisters of St. Joseph, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, and others. See what are they thinking about these days? Now, another example of how we're doing things trans-congregationally is that the Religious Formation Conference established an intercongregational novitiate. And I think there's at least one congregation among you this week that has some novices in that new novitiate. So this novitiate is where women from various congregations are living together for their formation in Chicago. This too is just another example of religious providing what is needed together, rather than each institute trying to provide an essential service merely on its own. Many institutes are hiring more lay employees and giving them more responsibility and authority. So, for example, more are hiring chief operating officers. Institutes are finding ways to share employees across congregations. So, for example, one business office for several communities. This removes the need to have congregation members assuming the management of the institute, especially as the complex work of divestment, property sales, repurposing of buildings, and much more occurs. So it might be interesting for you to share some of those stories of what's already happening with your own sisters. I find it very, very interesting. I think many sisters would find that interesting. And then my last recommendation is to tell the stories of younger religious. Whether or not your institute has young members or not, tell the stories of how young sisters are living religious life today. It's important that all sisters know that there are women still choosing this way of life, that they value it, and they want to see it flourish. You know, it really almost doesn't matter anymore within which communities these young women decide to live. There is clear recognition among younger members that religious life will continue to be intergenerational, more intercultural, and more trans-congregational. Young religious are strongly tied to their own communities, and at the same time recognize that their peer companionship and support will most likely be enhanced with relationships outside of their own communities. Almost all have had intercongregational initial formation experiences. Many participate in Giving Voice and the Leadership Collaborative, which are both efforts to provide connection and development opportunities to younger members. Interestingly, most tell us that they don't know religious life in any other way other than in smaller communities living religious life trans-congregationally. So interesting, isn't it, that what older religious would consider so foreign, younger religious know of no other reality but smaller communities living trans-congregationally. The images of large, self-contained communities that most sisters carry aren't even in their consciousness of young religious. That is definitely not to say that younger religious are seeking to break off from their communities and form new communities. To the contrary, being part of an intergenerational group seems to remain a priority for young religious who truly value the differences in generations. We heard frequently that they want to shape their own future, and they want a voice in congregation discernment about decisions that will impact the future that they will be living. But they want to do that with the wisdom, support, and blessing of the older generations. You know, you may have seen that LCWR began a fund to support initiatives and efforts of women religious ages 55 and younger. Perhaps you had members in your own congregations apply to this fund. This will be a really interesting effort to watch and see what young members do and what they learn if their grant applications are accepted. So that's the end of my presentation. I wish I were with you to ask you, how do these ideas sound to you? Do they ring true to your experience? And are there places where your experience is different than what I described? I would be really interested in hearing what you think, and I welcome your input and feedback at any time. Again, we know at LCWR that your work on behalf of women religious is essential. So please, please know how much all of us at LCWR value what you're doing, appreciate it, and want to hear from you. Thank you.